Afternoon. Welcome to our special Science Communication Colloquium. It is so great to have a room full of colleagues and students and a virtual room also full of colleagues from around the world, I think. So what a great start to our colloquium program for the year. And the program is a work in progress. We will develop it as we go, but we hope that this will be the first of a few more colloquia for this year. So my name is Mahita Ikani, and on behalf of the South African Research Chair in Science Communication and the Journalism Department, really happy to welcome you to this colloquium. And to also welcome our very special guest, Dr. Ellie Armstrong, who is visiting us from the UK. We're really lucky that she decided to come spend a little bit of time with us here in Stellenbosch in South Africa. And we're really looking forward to hearing more about her work in space science communication. But let me just tell you a little bit about Dr. Armstrong before she kicks off with her presentation. So she is a space research fellow at the University of Leicester in the United Kingdom, where she leads something wonderful called the Constellations Lab. So I think you have like the best job title, Space Research Fellow, and you work in the coolest sounding lab, the Constellations Lab. So we all have some life goals to aspire to now after hearing about how your work identity is organized. So her PhD was awarded from UCL, University College London in 2020. And since then, she's held posts at the University of Delaware and Stockholm University, as well as visiting positions at, among others, the University of Cambridge, Ingenium Canada's Museums of Science and Innovation, New York University, and University of Vienna. So we have a truly global scholar with us today. What a privilege. Dr. Armstrong is also a trustee of Pride in STEM, and co-lead of the International Biannual Conference Space Science in Context, and co-developer of a design studio called ExoMoan. So her research focuses on two main themes. The first is on queer feminist approaches to social studies of outer space, particularly the presentation of femininities, feminisms, and femmes in public discourses about outer space. And secondly, on anti-colonial work in science and natural history museums. I know that both of these themes will be of great interest to the group collected here today. And without any further ado, let me hand over to Ellie, already fondly known as Ellie in our department, to talk about her presentation.
Right. I think that the sound is coming through online because I can see the transcript, but if you can't hear me online, now is the moment to make some noise, and hopefully you can see me as well. So thanks everyone. It's super exciting to be here in Stellenbosch and to get to share my work with you. I was going to tell you about myself, but Mahita's already done that, so I'm going to skip that bit of the talk. But today I'm going to talk to you about a presentation. I'm going to talk to you about some work that is coming out in a paper that I've written called Riot Stars: Understanding Alternative Pedagogies Created in Space Science Education. And I was really hoping that I could be like, and here's a QR code and you can go and read it, but it's coming out this week, so it's not out yet, which is very annoying. But anyway, it's coming out at Cultural Studies of Science Education. And so if you are interested in the ideas that I present today and you use them in your academic work, please feel free to cite this paper, as caring feminist praxis is also making sure that we attribute our ideas where we find them. Just to note that the work that I'm presenting today is in part based on funding, a project that was funded by the University of Delaware Cultural Activities and Public Events, which was awarded to myself and my then PI, Julie Klinger, when I was a postdoc at the University of Delaware in the US. And so thanks to them for supporting this research. And thank you so much for having me here at the Science Communication Research Chair in Stellenbosch University. It's a really exciting time to be here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by contextualizing my wider research program on kind of dominant narratives and subversive narratives about outer space in public discourse. And then I'm going to dive more deeply into a selection of zines on which this research is based that are written in English, purchased online, and were kind of grouped together between November and December 2021. And that will help us understand some of the topics and themes that emerge around spaces of informal, bottom-up counter-narratives in science communication pedagogies. I know that not everyone here is interested in science. A lot of you are here in other kinds of news contexts and journalistic contexts. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how this kind of helps us understand a wider context. So in my research, I think a lot about how narratives in science communication and science education can be conceptualized through Stuart Hall's idea of the official and unofficial cultural producers, where official cultural producers, often part of the elite or sanctioned organizations, use culture and cultural narratives to maintain power and to occupy that kind of dominant position in our society. And then we can see unofficial producers and actors producing subversive, often resistance, renegotiations or negotiations of the kinds of cultural ideas that can be permeating our society through their own production and the kind of subversive consumption of official narratives as well. And one of the things that this helps us see through Stuart Hall's formulation is the ways in which this allows non-official actors to have transformative action and change the way that we might think about the dominant official narratives that are being produced, right? So when we see people telling stories in different ways, we can then see those stories being picked up by dominant outlets and changing the kind of like transforming the way that we might talk about a particular issue in due course. So I'm really interested in how outer space and space science in particular, as kind of like the, charismatic megafauna, they're like the panda bears of physics, I think, where it's like, it's kind of got some catchy pictures, it's got some fun people who are astronauts. And this means that it features in lots and lots of different branches of both formal and informal education about physics. This might be things like museum galleries, science textbooks, fiction, non-fiction, toys, podcasts, movies, all these kind of things. And so these are often official productions, right? Like they're made by official actors, but those spaces are often kind of co-opted and transformed by unofficial actors to resist those traditional framings that maybe lean on or perpetuate these traditional framings that lean on or perpetuate colonial, cis-patriarchal and militarized narratives about how we can think about space. As Hall emphasizes, cultural concerns are different in different places. They are culturally and contextually specific. So I want to draw attention to the fact that my work is situated in the global north. I use these Anglophone zines that I bought, and one of the things that I reflect on in this paper is that these are mostly based on US cultural narratives, UK cultural narratives, and that I'm also drawing some knowledge on Swedish cultural contexts as well. Okay, so it's not my main focus, but I think it's important so that we're all in the same context to understand what some of these dominant cultural narratives about outer space are, right? Because maybe we are not all on the same page in this moment. So in my wider research, not that I'm going to talk about today, but in my wider research, I've looked at how museums also generate and sustain official narratives. But the top line of that research is that these many of the imaginaries about outer space that are produced and sustained through museums are fundamentally informed by Cold War ideologies, binary powers of like the USA versus the USSR, militarization, frontiering through the kind of capitalist colonialist expansion, technoscience domination of outer space, drawing on kind of ideas of the American West and the American expansionism. And I think we're all familiar with kind of ideas of like the first man on the moon being Buzz Aldrin and being Neil Armstrong, and the ways that this reproduces and reinscribes hegemonic US white masculinities as the dominant types of identity that are at play within space. So instead, I want to just give you some like brief context about the kinds of ideas that circulate in Europe and America about the policy discussions for education, both formal and informal, about what outer space can offer young people and youth and informal learners in these contexts. What you might notice in all of the things that I have put on here, from the 2022 European Space Agency guiding framework for their Space for Education 2030, to the Space Education Europe Space Policy Institute reports, the report from Our Space, Our Future, this picture from NASA, from the UK Space Agency, is that these are all dominated by the idea that outer space is fundamentally an inspirational context for young learners who are therefore will be compelled to join STM's science, technology, engineering, mathematics as practicing scientists, technologists, engineers, mathematicians of the future. So we see space as this idea that this can be inspiring. It can compel young people to join these spaces. And to quote the report from the European Space Agency, quote, "Space is inspirational. It's aimed at using the wow factor to generate a space to spark children and teenagers' curiosity and imagination." This kind of permeates the discourse in Europe. So indeed, in a study by DeWitt and Bultitude in 2020, they have a paper called Space Science, a View from European School Students, that argues that, quote, while space science subjects are thought to be particularly inspirational, there's actually little research to capture what this means in the educational context. Like, does this mean that people are more excited by it? Does it mean that they do better in classes? It's just kind of used as an empty signifier. And especially there's very little research in how this might be shaped by gendered, racial, or disability differences in educational contexts. So when we focus on what this means in relation to informal education in outer space, we can see that this idea of inspiration sits alongside other kinds of emotional registers that we might normally talk about outer space on. These include things like awe and wonder. So these have which are emotions that have garnered attention and demonstrated as part of the discourse around outer space by other scholars. For example, a scholar called Kirby argues that wonder is often used as a framing device in the kind of science documentaries and television series led by famous Western men about the universe. If anyone knows of like the Brian Cox universe, this is a very good example of that. But also we can really see it with like Bill Nye's work in America, for example. Another person whose surname is also Nye, but is not Bill Nye, the science guy, showed that this was also the case in the way that the media narrated the Apollo space program, while Elizabeth Kessler talks about how these kind of ideas of awe and wonder are fundamental in the ways that the popular images of the Hubble Space Telescope circulate for viewing publics. So this idea of awe and wonder and inspiration as the learning experience about science, and particularly space science, is kind of through the discourse, but people like Luna and Bering in a 2020 paper advocate for us to actually be more critical about this and to think about the other kinds of emotions and registers, particularly in out-of-school learning about science, that are more locally constructed, more socially contingent, and more culturally informed for the learners who participate in them. And in doing so, in turning and thinking about what other registers we might have to talk about outer space, we can expose the power structures that frame the invocation of specific emotions about awe, inspiration, and what those are meant to stimulate in the viewing publics, how that means that we are meant to relate to these as like kind of projects that are demonstrations of modernity, that are demonstrations of power, and rather than taking on those narratives wholesale as kind of unofficial cultural actors, we're able to see how we could challenge those narratives, how we could perhaps transform those public understandings, and what that might look like otherwise. So before I get into talking about mine, I just want to give an example of how we can see this playing out in other contexts as well. While images from telescopes, as I told you, are often viewed as this idea of like awe-inspiring, wondrous, gazing into the deep universe, there is, for example, a whole bunch of this that comes from an observatory called the Keck Observatory, which is located in Mauna Kea in Hawaii. And these are billed as images that are going to be amazing to inspire science participation. However, in as early as 2013, because I think people think of this, what I'm going to talk about, as being kind of a later 2020s phenomena, but as early as 2013, in Howell's study, for example, many communities do not find these images to invoke amazement as the proper cultural response in the learning subject. Instead, they're tied, people, especially Indigenous Hawaiians, their experience of seeing these images is tied up in the emotional and actual violence of transnational colonial theft, and that is fostering subjugation in those spaces. We can see this in Uahia Maile's documentation on Cruising Mauna Kea, which is about the protests that were founded against the 30-meter telescope by Kanaka Maoli. And people rejecting these technological advances, particularly Indigenous Hawaiians who lead the resistance against building telescopes on their sacred lands. We might see Castanbul Salazar's, for example, 2017 book, First Light. They are recast by scientists as the epistemic other who do not correctly understand science or the effect of inspiration, and thus are positioned as like against techno-scientific modernity, by scientists who fundamentally believe that these ideas of inspiration, awe, and wonder should be culturally pervasive. This alienation is well captured in a paper in 2023 by Toffel Graham, which is titled "There is no room for me, a Hawaiian in science, rightful presence in community science," where the story of one student, Leiliana, who is a Kanaka Maoli youth and participated in activism at the Moana, as well as other local community events, both of resistance and joy within the Indigenous Hawaiian community, describes how, quote, "From Leiliana's starting point, community science was not possible because science has been a violent external force that acted upon her community, not something that embraced or helped her community. Community science, to Leiliana, was an anthemia." Her teacher confirmed this perspective and noted that scientific companies in town, by which they mean mostly the telescopes, but also other military industrial complex companies, often offer schools in Hawaii money for science education. But these monies are routinely declined even by financially struggling schools, such as the contrast between what the schools and the Indigenous people want and the values and positions of science institutions. Science for these communities in the paper, science is not seen as being relevant to her life and community. It's not seen as being something that family members want to participate in. They note in the paper that some of her family members quit lucrative jobs at the telescope because they saw this in conflict with their personal values. And so space science in these contexts, for example, is not filled with inspiration and wonder and awe, but instead is in conflict with their own values, their own beliefs, and their own community practice. So what would it mean if we thought differently about how we can talk about outer space? Instead of just appealing to these normative narratives, how else might we think about this? Okay. So to try and do this, to try and grapple with some of the ways that we could see other kinds of narratives taking place, these kind of bottom-up, unofficial narratives that are produced by non-official actors, I've looked at zines. Now, some of you, just a quick show of hands in the room, who knows what a zine is? Anyone seen these before? Okay, cool. I like a 50-50. Great. So zines are a form of education at the margins, and they're what I would describe as part of a kind of wider phenomena of public pedagogy, learning in a public context or outside of the classroom. And so these kind of like extra institutional spaces or discourses, as Sandlin, O'Malley, and Burdick describe them, we might be guided by cultural studies and arts-based approaches with the attention to who the public are, who the producers are, what kinds of knowledge is both embodied and sustained through these. Work in the fields of like public pedagogy, it examines both how social norms and hegemonic ideas are reproduced, but also how these knowledges are resisted. So we see these public spaces as being kind of part of that framework of being able to challenge, but also reproduce the dominant narratives. So self-made and self-published zines, like these ones here, are made by people who are known as zinesters. And they are described, as Duncombe has described here, as non-commercial, non-professional, small circulation magazines, which their creators produce, publish, and distribute by themselves. They often represent engagement with topics and themes and issues that their creators perceive to be underrepresented in formal education and existing media. Their style, as Cresap notes in this quote here, is, quote, decidedly informal. Images are hand-drawn or cut and paste by hand. Essays, poems, or confessional stories might also be handwritten or typed with drawings framing the paragraphs. We can see kind of like a step towards the digital. These are analog objects that have been created for most of the 20th century, some of the 1800s, most of the 1900s, and also now. But with the advent of the internet, we can see this kind of being transported onto the digital environment, and people now also make digital zines that are not physical objects that you might have in your hand. Zines have a long history in the pedagogies of resistance. They've been part of projects like the Riot Girl zines produced in the Pacific Northwest in the United States in the 1980s, where women who were part of a punk rock scene, where they were not reviewed and not credited by official music reviewers, produced their own zines to create an ecosystem that promoted women's music at this time. In the 1920s and 1940s, science fiction was largely written in these zines, and they often took published books of science fiction and created kind of alternative worlds. I guess the original fanfic was produced in this way and then circulated in these zines. And with the advent of the photocopier in the 1990s, there is the emergence of personal zines, or per-zines, which saw widespread reproduction of these objects and circulating them. People often used to do it at work, unknown to their employers, for example. They would take them in and effectively steal ink and paper for their own objects that they then would sell and circulate to their friends. These are made cheaply. They're sold through informal distribution networks called distros. And as physical objects, they represent an analog channel that allows us to share information or develop curricula beyond those sanctioned by institutions. As a zine scholar Lincona describes, quote, they can be irreverent, periodic, utopian, and imaginative. Thus, in a sense, zines perform the differences they are trying to make. While many are available for purchasing or viewing online, as I've said, they're kind of distinct from digitally native formats like blogs or videos or slideshows or podcasts, but they have some of the same ideas about taking ownership of that content production and talking about things that are different. So by focusing on zines, I'm trying to exemplify some of the broader calls within public pedagogy to deinstitutionalize conceptions of teaching and learning from schools and other institutions, and instead focus on these kind of grassroots, independently produced zine materials that allows us to see different kinds of activities, different kinds of knowledge, and different kinds of work being produced by people outside of those dominant positions in society. Doing research on and with zines has a series of ethical considerations that are kind of brought together under what's called the Zine Librarian's Code of Ethics, which you can find online if you Google it. And this underpins my work. The idea is that you are respectful, and broadly they describe not being an asshole about using other people's work. So the idea is you shouldn't be reproducing everything that somebody has in their zine, but it's fine to engage and talk to this. And the zines that I show you here, I've been in touch with the authors about their reproduction in my slides and in my paper. Okay, so zines can be about everything. There's a really wonderful archive of zines actually in South African zines by Zanele Moholi. They have a really wonderful collection of zines from the 1990s, South African zines, but I'm particularly going to think about zines that are about science and outer space. And these are maybe less common in the kind of wider, both wider literature, scholarly literature about zines, and also in the production. It's not really popular to consider them within libraries that collect these kind of things. But we kind of see some different ways of understanding science bleeding into these zine collections. So for example, they will house things like zines on cooking, if we think of cooking as a scientific pursuit, health, fertility and reproduction, technical skills, and for example, being critical of the state military industrial science complex, or histories of science. In fact, the History of Science one quote, which is titled Witches, Midwives and Nurses, A History of Women's Healers, was argued to be foundational to the women's movement in the 1970s in the US, that encouraged people to look at their own vaginas using mirrors. And some of these exist within libraries, and thus science is often organized into these zines by thinking about the practical application of science rather than kind of these abstract notions of science that we're maybe more familiar with talking about around zines. But there's growing interest in this. So there are new distribution centers or distros that are specifically focused on scientific themes, like Geozone Zines or the Small Science Collective, which collate and then distribute these zines. And also in academic conferences, there's an increasing interest in this, both at the American Association of Geographers and the Social Studies of Science conference this year. They're having zine festivals, so there are also questions about what it means to co-opt this kind of radical resistive practice into the academy that are rising right now. But there are two types of science in zines that are well documented. One is medical zines, and these are often personal zines. They are detailed about how to take medical care of yourself, particularly foregrounding transgressive health practices, issues that especially affect minoritized folk, for example, those with non-normative genders, sexualities, disabilities, or racialized discrimination in the healthcare system, or how to do kind of ad hoc at-home medical care. And there's also a growing use of zines within the climate crisis activism. And in this context, this is kind of to radically reimagine what it might mean to talk about the climate crisis, how we might think about talking about the kind of images and imaginaries that underpin the climate crisis. And those zines sit alongside other material culture that we might think about as part of the climate crisis activism. For example, paint thrown by Just Stop Oil, the banners from Friday for Futures, or nuclear resistance badges and crafts that have long been produced in nuclear resistance. Okay, so in the absence of kind of a clear archival collection of outer space zines, I made one through the funding that I talked about at the start. And I kind of purchased over 30 zines that were about space science. And these I purchased online, which is quite unusual. The more common way of purchasing zines is at zine fairs, but this was during the pandemic and couldn't go and see other people. So I bought them online. And these were either ones that I found through searching on marketplace aggregators or recommendations from colleagues and friends and activists who were also interested in space science. This is clearly not a representative sample of all zines about outer space, but I'm not pretending that it is either. Instead, we want to think about how these might document some of the emerging themes about what we might talk about otherwise within space zines. Maybe you have noticed this, but I talk about space. I don't mean like geographical space. I often mean like outer space, but just so that we're clear and it doesn't get confusing. Space science, outer space, and space I've kind of used as like interchangeable terms. And I probably should have mentioned that slightly earlier in this talk. Anyway, I'm going to talk through a couple of my favorite zines and the kinds of ideas that they bring to the space and how we might take those with us into other parts of space discourse. The first is this zine that you can see pictured on the left, which is part of a zine called I'm Mad They Left Poop on the Moon and You Should Be Too by Sarah Baggs. It's a small A6 one-page zine. It's printed in grayscale on white paper, and the zine is like reading a short chat with a friend who's particularly angry about something. Baggs is outraged, but finds the content also kind of comical. This is a conversational and irreverent tone. It's characteristic of what is possible within zine communications. It's not that formal register of writing. It's more of a chat on the internet. And it strikes this very different tone to the seriousness with which, for example, toilets and waste in space is often discussed in museums or on the internet around like the International Space Station. For example, it also particularly subverts the normative like awe register that we have about the moon landing. It's like, wow, isn't it amazing? They put people on the moon. And Baggs says, quote, the idea that the moon might simultaneously be so enticingly awe-inspiring as to drive us to slip the surly bonds of Earth and so unworthy of respect as to justify leaving sewage on it baffles me. I cannot reconcile the two attitudes. Instead of seeing the moon and speculative trips beyond it to Mars and the asteroid belt as part of like this American pastoral inspired nostalgia with awe and sublime, which are all really deeply ideas that are tied in with American settler colonial expansion and the promises of manifest destiny, Baggs here delivers a poetical phrasing to kind of deliver an eco-critical narrative. It offers a novel approach to understanding our relationship to outer space. Through Baggs's witty and subversive description of the deposition and abandonment of feces and vomit on the moon as acts that, quote, just smack of American colonialist nonsense, end quote, Baggs challenges these normative narratives that gloss over the mundane realities of space travel and instead confront the shittier parts of the space project. Striking a conversational tone allows Baggs to lean into sensory and emotional experiences that might otherwise be seen as out of place in narratives about outer space. For example, in the anger that she expresses in I'm Mad They Left Poop on the Moon, where she says, quote, but when I first heard that there were 96 bags of shit, piss, and puke on the moon, my trivia bone was not tickled. I was angry. Lincona argues that one of the features of zines as a context is that they are a space to use anger as a rhetorical tool, as a strategy for coalition building, right? So we can make informed meaning making, we can compel readers to actions through these zines. And interestingly, this zine here, you can see kind of in the image that I put up, she's got a little picture of a change.org petition that is petitioning for the removal of the poop that is left on the moon. And so you can see in this way, Baggs is using anger in a way that is possible and normative within zine making, but perhaps otherwise not so common, to motivate action-oriented critical consciousness work by the reader. In using the quotidian, the poop on the moon, in relation to outer space, it's possible for making new ways of relating to outer space. And in challenging those hegemonic ways of relating to the trip to the moon as being this kind of amazing and awe-inspiring space, I'm Mad They Left Poop on the Moon demonstrates that outer space research is always tied with colonial capitalism and its schemas of waste and waste making that permeate the military-industrial complex and the environmental relationships that are part of that. And you can see more about that kind of idea in LeBron and Lepowski's colonial, I think it's like a reader on waste studies, but it's very good. Anyway, so this critical consciousness about manifest destiny, in American manifest destiny in particular in space, is also writ large in this other zine that I really enjoyed, which is called If You Love Space, Don't Colonize It, a primer for Elon Musk. From its title through to its content, this zine is a critique of the capitalist colonialism that Musk anticipates in space in his narratives about what it might mean for people to live on Mars. Written in this kind of cursive handwriting with cut and paste illustrations, the zine demonstrates an argument about the problems of extending capitalist colonialist frameworks into space. Quote, all we've done is kill people and destroy the land, all in the name of resources, and it's never enough. Why would space be any different? Rhetorical questions like this one are followed by statements that look for alternative possible futures that divest from this future colonization, suggesting that outer space could, quote, be protected like any other natural resource for generations to come. Arguing that this should be like any other natural resource suggests a position that departs from ongoing normative extractivist orientations to nature by bringing in a part of a public who sees nature as something that should be protected rather than extracted from. This is a different way of both thinking about like nature in America, which is often seen as this space for extraction, but also the way that we could think about outer space. This, I will say, I bought this in 2021, and I think that this is probably a much more widely held position as Elon Musk becomes much worse or much more explicitly bad and more obviously in favor of this very deeply colonialist capitalist practice, both in the United States and also in space and in the wider world. There's their ideas about how to take over the waterfront in Gaza through genocide. So zine aesthetics are always political, and they always take these positions against or in relation to existing knowledge, generating new knowledge in the process. There's like an aesthetic remixing that's also possible. And one of the ways that this aesthetic remixing is really obvious and visible is by bridging ideas of what is scientific and what is cultural into the same space rather than treating the two separately. This transgression in aesthetic styles is particularly visible in some pictures that I've got later in the presentation about tarot or little pictures of animals who have been into space. But as you can see here, there's also this idea of tying moon phases and scientific descriptions of moon phases with kind of supernatural or supernatural meanings of the moon cycle. So in this image here, you probably can't read it because it's a bit blurry, but the author of the zine describes this as, quote, the new moon phase occurs when the moon is between the Earth and the sun. The far side of the moon is in full sunlight and the near side of the moon receives no sunlight. The lack of illumination means we cannot see the near side of the moon at all. So a very scientific description of how the new moon works, but it's immediately followed underneath with a description that says the new moon is the best time for starting over, and it's a time where you should write down your hopes and dreams and desires on paper and bring them into action. And we can see that in this scene, there is no tension for the author between this very scientific description of how the moon is being made visible in the sky and the spiritual actions that it encourages in the individual. The two knowledge claims are presented and afforded equal weight in the design of the page and speak to the individual reading them as equally important ways of relating to the moon. Likewise, in this zine on the right, no, on the left, sorry, my left and right is terrible, we can see that this is a way of pluralizing what kinds of publics can be brought into the texts. So in this scene, it's a compilation called Is Space the Place? Nope. The compilation aims towards critical consciousness raising and encouraging socially just actions. And amongst the collection of essays is an essay by Lindsay Catherine Coram called The Space Indian Star Map. And in it, Coram relies on discursive familiarity implicit in the reader of the text with Indigenous science fiction authors like Robert Sullivan and Zainab Amahadi, science fiction direction, Becker, and descriptions of filming in Monument Valley as a kind of given shared knowledge between the writer and the reader. where this is not normally the way that we think about shared reference points in science communication. They're often the idea that the thing that might be culturally relevant and culturally permeating is stuff about white Americans in the space program. And instead, in this essay by Coram, foregrounding of DNA cultures, space Indians, and for example, the photograph of Geronimo in a Cadillac, call into being a very different indigenous culture-oriented public who are anticipated to be reading the zine. However, even when resisting these hegemonic framings, and there are many others that I haven't gone into but appear in the paper, many of these zines kind of still lean on and critique the US space. And this is probably because I've picked mostly Anglophone zines, and I also purchased them when I was in the US and the UK, and so the algorithm shared me mostly of those things. But I'd be really interested to see if there are more of these things outside of this space. Okay, I had like one more that I'm just gonna like gloss over very quickly, but the idea at this point is that these zines often relate to quotidian themes in everyday life, and that they don't rely on what we might normally see related to in outer space. It might be animals, it might be shadows on the moon, as you can see here in the Moon's Myths and Comics About the Moon. In Chella Quint's zine, which is not pictured here, It's Not You, I Just Need Space. She writes interplanetary love letters between the planets and kind of HR complaints about Pluto being exiled from the solar system. And finally, this zine in the middle by Wyrick is Spaceship or Sex Toy, draws on the everyday object like the dildo as a way of connecting to or contrasting with outer space in a kind of camp, tongue-in-cheek, irreverent contrast of the V2 and the vibrator. And so looking back through all these zines, we can see a range of very different relationships, very different cultural touch points being pulled to the fore that we don't normally see in the kind of hegemonic idea that these are inspirational or inspiring and wondrous. And this echoes what zine theorists have said in other contexts, including, for example, Lauren Ballant and Janine Brady, as a space where we can kind of construct an alternative discourse, where building community knowledge and developing leadership and new narratives through unofficial public pedagogy can take place from these non-conventional social positions, and they offer us new directions for discourse. Just to reflect on these, I've been really interested in thinking about what it means to do this kind of work and to bring these objects together. As you can see, one of these is a tarot card, and the other one is a little portrait of a cat. But one of the things that this has demonstrated is that we could use some of these ideas to challenge and change the types of outreach activities, for example, that are being led, or the kinds of norms and expectations into being more culturally specific, more local, and more responsive to what people are thinking about and talking about in their own lives. Just because I told you that this was based on a paper, that's obviously coming out. But if you'd like to look at some other things that kind of touch on similar questions, Mahita mentioned at the start that I've been organizing, oh, the blue has come up very badly. Good job, it's got a nice white picture. I've been organizing a conference called Space Science in Context. And really, if any of this has been interesting to you, this is a conference that I've been organizing since 2020. And we've had now, I guess, nearly 40 talks in an association, which are all recorded online, that think about these critical approaches and relationships to outer space. And you can apply, they're like behind a password, but it's not a paid one, so you can apply to look at that. And those speakers foreground global perspectives on the intersection of space and society, including indigenous advocacy groups, decolonial activism, and the interrelation of space industries and global genocides, critical remote sensing, and eco-critical environmentalism. And I also encourage you, if you're interested in any of these issues, but you'd like to read them in a different context, to look at this special issue that I've produced with a colleague of mine, Camille Marie Sharp, where we look at, with a similar lens, at geological and mineralogical collections, and we ask what it might mean to think about these collections in museums as being fundamentally part of environmental, extractivist, and imperial legacies. And you can always follow me online or come and chat to me afterwards if you have any questions, but thank you very much. Okay, but I was gonna say, do you want to have a little chat with the person next to them, and then chat with the person next to you, and then. I mean, I would say no, but I think one of the things that, but I think that we should be cautious about what we mean by conspiracy theorists and quacks, right? Yeah. No, I mean, yeah, yeah. So I used to work at the Science Museum in London, and I did have somebody come up to me, and we had a conversation about how this person thought that the Earth was flat. And we talked about a lot of things. And one of the things that I realized is that there was like no recourse to being able to talk to this person in a way that meant that we shared really any of the same understandings about how the world worked. Things that I thought were obvious and demonstrable proofs of the fact that the Earth is round. This person just didn't understand in that way. And I do think that while it's important to make sure that we have lots of different views represented, and I think the talk that I've given is like an advocacy for making sure that it's not always Brian Cox and Neil deGrasse Tyson, and especially Neil deGrasse Tyson because he's been accused of sexual harassment, and Brian Cox and people like this. I do think it's important that we have like a wider discourse around what it means to participate in outer space, right? Like we maybe don't need to have people who are flat earthers or deniers of rockets, but it is important to get the voices of people who live near telescopes or rocket ranges, for example, and understand their experiences of how these like large techno-scientific infrastructures impact their lives, shape their communities, and possibly damage them as well. Wait, can you introduce yourselves as well when you say your question? Because otherwise I have no idea who anyone is. Thanks. Mm, yep. Mm, yep. Yeah. Yeah. So I'm going to repeat your question because I don't think people online can hear, but the question is like, where do we draw the line between quackery and like cultural knowledge, cultural relationships that maybe are seen as like quote unquote less scientifically valid than quote unquote Western science, right? If we're making artificial distinctions. I think that there are kind of two registers to your question. One is like a more scholarly question, which I think is like the questions that are maybe being researched about disinformation and misinformation, and like where do we, or what do we mean when we say like to draw a line between these different things? And I think that's like a kind of more of an epistemic question about whose knowledge is valid, whose knowledge is seen to be outside of the cultural norm to begin with, right? Which knowledge is already like always already seen as being close to quackery. And I think we can like space is maybe a more difficult example to see this in, but we can definitely see this in the way that medical knowledge is treated, for example. I think that's a very important place to think about this. And that's a scholarly area that I'm not in, but I happen to know that at least one or two people here are researching this in this department. So continue that conversation with them. But the second level, I think, is more of like a practical level, right? Which is like, what does this mean to do this in a journalistic context? And I guess you're all being trained to be journalists. And part of that is, I think, to have a robust understanding of what you think is a valuable and valid cultural context. And I guess as journalists, right, like you would be the ones who are deciding, like, is this quackery or is this like valuable and valid cultural knowledge when you're reporting on it, when you're including it in reports. And I think having discussions that talk about why some types of cultural knowledge and some types of cultural relationships to space or to medicine or to other kinds of like environmental worlds, for example, right? Like how do we relate to the land? How do we relate to materials that come out of the land or trees or animals? To be critical and to be like in this environment, discussing the importance of making sure that those like worldviews, often indigenous worldviews, but not always, are not written out as being like pseudoscience or not Western science, but can instead be included and valued in the ways that I think I demonstrated in some of these zines, right, where we can hold two different ideas about how to relate to an object kind of equally in this context. But yeah, thanks, really interesting question. Mm, yeah. Yep. 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 Yeah. So I think this. I think there is certainly the potential for doing this. Is how I'm going to open this. I really see like, especially there's some other theorists. There's a theorist called Jones. I can't remember what his first name is. But he writes about how zines are really popular right now, particularly in the academy, because of their physicality as like a response to the digital learning of the pandemic and the digital classroom. That their tactility and their physicality is like one of the reasons that these seem to be particularly zeitgeisty in 2024, 2025. And so I think one of the things that's interesting is maybe like 5 to 10 years ago, these weren't super popular ways of disseminating information or sharing information. Maybe we would have seen more stuff on kind of like Instagram activism, like those images that are like the carousel, or podcasting. But I really feel like in the past couple of years, this has become more of a like space for producing this. And in that context, I think there's definitely the potential for objects like this to build a counterpower like you talk about. I think they like kind of require some momentum behind them, some momentum behind that power already, and some like organization. So for example, the work that has been happening by the indigenous Kanaka Maoli people in Hawaii against the 30-meter telescope was a large like physical protest. They produced lots of like visual and material ephemera that like post both photographs, like digital photographs, but also material banners, like religious objects that were like devotional objects given to the mountain, and also a lot of like discourse and small kind of like easily digestible ideas to be able to tackle these issues. And this has like led now through the leadership of some of the people in that community to like a petition to the UN on the basis of the rights of indigenous people to still have their land, to reject the construction of this under like Canadian sovereignty, Canadian law, and like American law. That kind of was put together in 2024, 2023, 2024, and it's been sent to the UN. I think there are like obviously other questions about how efficient the UN is against like any state, but particularly like the fascist America that we see right now. But I think like what we can see is the production of these physical objects and these like knowledge through this kind of space definitely has the potential to bring together these communities. And in the past, in other contexts, it also has really done this. So we can see this in the Riot Girl zines in particular. This really built a community of like feminist rock musicians across the United States in the 1980s. We can see this in producing communities around nuclear activism in the UK, for example, in the 1970s. And so I think there's definitely the potential for this to take place. I haven't seen it yet, but I have hope and dreams. fine. The less we say about him, maybe the better. The less we say, maybe we can all in our hearts know that we, yeah. Yeah, yeah. So the NASA motivation for leaving it on the moon is that it's heavy, it's just waste. And one of the ways that we think about outer space is this kind of like infinite resource that we can deposit things in. And so not only did they leave like poop and all kinds of other gross stuff on the moon, they also left like parts of the spacecraft, for example, that they didn't need for getting back. They left American flags. And we do the same thing to like low Earth orbit. So we might have heard about space debris as an issue that is facing the world. This is when we launch satellites, particularly Earth observation satellites that look back at Earth and help us with understanding things like climate change and environmental change, but they have a lifespan, and for some of them the lifespan is not very long, maybe 5 years. Some of them the lifespan is longer, maybe up to 50 years, but we've been putting those into space since the 1950s, and when they stop working, rather than rather than doing anything about it, we kind of just leave them there, and they populate areas around the Earth. That means that we can't put other satellites there, but we also are just polluting that space as well. So it's like a fairly pervasive attitude to outer space, that it's kind of infinite and we can just leave stuff there, but actually it's not. Spaces like the moon are fundamentally like a fixed amount of surface area, and spaces around the Earth like low Earth orbit or geostationary orbit are also fixed amounts of space. And even if we do bring them back down from space, there's often lots of questions about what to do with them when you re-enter things from space. So like satellites or rockets, they burn up in the atmosphere because of the energy that the atmosphere exerts on these rockets. And that means that we end up with really small particulate waste distributed in the high atmosphere. So that might be small particulate metallic waste, or asbestos, for example, that is distributed high in the atmosphere. And we don't really know what happens to the atmosphere as a result of putting quite a lot of pollution in that high space. Or it is a really big object like the International Space Station. When the International Space Station gets deorbited, probably in 2030, they will basically crash it into the Pacific Ocean. And there's a space in the Pacific Ocean called Point Nemo that's like the furthest point away from everywhere else in the world. And it's an ocean bed, and that is where satellites are deorbited, and they kind of live in this techno-scientific graveyard in the sea, but they're not collected, and then they're just left there. They become kind of a forced part of that ecosystem. Sometimes things re-enter over land where people live, and there seems to be very little care for that kind of stuff as well. There was a recent example in Saskatchewan where part of a SpaceX rocket landed in a farm. And this is like an international kind of thing where it's an American company, but it's landed in a Canadian farm. It's also happened with the Chinese rocket landing in other parts of other Chinese farms, but also landing nearly in Australia, and it missed Australia and nearly hit the Maldives. But there's no real international agreement about what should happen to that waste. And so often it also just gets left. In the case of the SpaceX rocket, some guys in a U-Haul van turned up and put it in the van and left. But it was unclear what was meant to be going on. And even in the case of well-documented and really public crashes of this waste back from space to Earth, for example, in the Northwest Territories in Canada in the 1970s, a Soviet radioactive satellite, it fell out of its orbit. It burnt up in the atmosphere and re-entered over the Northwest Territories, which is in the Arctic part of Canada, in the winter, so in the snow. And it distributed radioactive waste over an enormous portion of the Northwest Territories. And even then, which was very dangerous for people who lived there, mostly indigenous Inuit people who lived in that area, it's difficult to clean up. And also there was very little international interest in cleaning it up because it didn't affect major urban metropolitan areas. And they saw that area of Canada as being kind of a vast expanse that could take up that radioactive debris. There's a really interesting podcast that I'd highly recommend called Operation Morning Light, that's produced by a journalist, a Dene journalist who lives in the town nearest the crash, and he interviews local elders who were there at the crash and their experiences of being basically occupied by the US military as part of this like cleanup operation, and how ineffective the cleanup was, and how that nuclear waste has led to cancers and radioactive illnesses, both in the people who live there and also the animals and the environment nearby. It's a really great podcast if you're looking for that kind of vibe.
Last question.
Sorry. Yes. Yes, I think waste is such a like rich area of thinking about this as well. And like, I mean, one of the reasons I'm really interested in Le Boiron's scholarship about waste. There's a scholar in Max Le Boiron in the Newfoundland University, but has a really great book, like quite short, that I'd really recommend, called Pollution is Colonialism. And it's super interesting because what they talk about is also how waste is formulated in such a way that we think about like acceptable limits. So like if it's a small amount in the environment, that's acceptable, but if it's more than a threshold amount, then that becomes waste. And like, what does it mean to be able to think of the environment as a like sponge that will take up acceptable amounts of waste? Who is codifying those acceptable amounts, and what does that mean? It's a really great book. And then also like a waste studies reader, which Le Boiron also worked on. I really recommend both of those texts.
So I think we're out of time.
That's fine.
So
I'm out of brain cells.
You're out
as well.
of energy. So for those of you who are in the room and who aren't fasting, because it is Ramadan, obviously you can stay for some lunch and some snacks, and we can carry on the conversations. Those who joined online, thank you for signing in. Such a stimulating discussion. So many ideas to think about, and I hope the journalism cohort has got talking about possible leads or stories that would be worth time. So on that note, thank you for joining us, and we'll call it the end.
I was like, not for yourself. I used to have a lecturer who did that.